about how to use a manual film camera from start to finish with no experience necessary. Before we get into it though, we need to have a brief chat about triangles. Well, one triangle, the exposure triangle. If you know what this is already, stick around because there's lots more important info for you too. Like all triangles, it has three corners. They are ISO, shutter speed and aperture, and they are the three ways that we can change the amount of light in a photograph. That's all you need to know for now, as we'll get into much more detail about these in the next 10 minutes. I've tried to keep this one light-hearted and fun, so sit back, enjoy, and let's get going. This is a typical film camera. Just like a digital camera, it has a lens at the front with focus and aperture rings. In this case, the lens is removed and attached like this, but that will vary from make to make. On the top, there are dials for shutter speed and ISO selection and a shutter button here. Something that you don't see on a digital camera is this lever. This is the film advance lever and needs to be pulled before every move you make, I mean every shot you take. On the back, you'll find the viewfinder and not a lot else. Film cameras don't have screens. This lovely looking lever on the front has two functions. Push it round anti-clockwise and it arms the clockwork self-timer. Pressing the shutter will set it going and it will take a photo after about 8 seconds. Pushing it clockwise gives the depth of field preview, which shuts the aperture blades down to give you an idea, surprise surprise, of how the depth of field will look in the final photo. Like I said, to take a picture you just choose the shutter speed and aperture with the ISO determined by your film. Then you just pull the advance lever and press the shutter. This camera has a shutter lock which stops you taking accidental photos. This is important because it's fully mechanical, so it doesn't have an on-off switch. The switch on the left hand side is only for the light meter, and so that is optional. Before we can actually take any photos though, we need to load a film. This is done by lifting the film rewind until the back pops open. In the middle, you can see the shutter. This is what opens when you press the shutter release button, in theory for the amount of time that you tell it to using the shutter speed dial. In theory. This one is made of cloth, so it's best not to touch it. A damaged shutter will probably result in a damaged heart once you first set eyes upon a set of blank sheets of photo paper because all of your film is exposed beyond consolation. We then stick the film in, pull a bit out, and lay it flat. The speed of the film is the sensitivity of the film and acts as the first corner of the triangle. It is nowadays called ISO and was called ASA back in the day, but what difference does it make? It makes none. Higher ISO films are more sensitive and so require less light to give a properly exposed image. However, less light has the consequence of grainy images due to something called shot noise. This is not that important. Just remember that doubling the ISO will enable you to halve the amount of light to give the same exposure, and vice versa, at the expense of image quality. Or not, if you like grain. I am currently using Kodak Color Plus 200 because I find 200 is a good middle ground ISO for most daytime shots. I also use it because I'm a student and I can't afford any better films. I digress. This camera has a quick load system, which means we can just shut the back and forget all of our troubles. Most cameras don't have this however, and so you tend to need to pass the film through a slot in here. Closing the back, we flick this handle and give it a little turn until it tightens slightly. Not too much mind, else we'll pull the film out and that's really annoying. Pull the advance lever and pray that the winder turns. This means that the film is latched onto the lever and advancing properly. Check the shutter and repeat until you see the little nought in the window, and now you're ready. Moving on to corner 2 of the triangle. Shutter speed is really the time that the shutter is open for, so halving this number will halve the light. Going from 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second will require the light to be compensated for by a factor of 2 in one of the other two corners of the triangle. So we could use a film with double the ISO or decrease the f-stop. Speaking of which, the final corner is the aperture. Listen closely because this concept is slightly more subtle. You might want to watch this a couple of times if it's new to you. We begin by considering two measurements. The focal length of the lens, which is written on the side of the lens and it tells you how far zoomed in it is, and the diameter of the aperture blades when shut down. The ratio of these, that is, the focal length divided by the diameter, is called the f-stop. Rearranging, we note that the focal length divided by the f-stop will tell us the diameter of the aperture. This is why aperture values are written as f/stop, because it's focal length divided by the f-stop. This is also why lower f-stops give wider apertures, because when we divide by a smaller number, we are left with a bigger number. Smaller apertures, and thus higher f-stops, also have the effect of making more of the picture in focus. If that wasn't complicated enough, it is important to realise that the amount of light that the film sees is proportional not to the diameter of the aperture, but the area of the aperture. This means that we can't simply halve the f-stop to double the light, because halving the f-stop doubles the diameter, giving a quadrupling of the area. Thus, we must divide the f-stop by the square root of 2 to give the same effect as doubling the ISO or halving the shutter speed. This sounds crazy, and it kind of is, but thankfully you don't have to learn your root 2 times tables if you don't want to. Lenses have indications of the f-stops, and they are handily given in intervals of root 2. It's still a good idea to spend time to get your head around this, as an intuitive feeling for what is happening will make life much easier. I'll link a couple of other videos that explain this concept well down below, and I'll make a more comprehensive explanation regarding the ins and outs of the exposure triangle in the future, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on that. This camera doesn't have any kind of automation, so you have to get your priorities right and find the balance between shutter speed and aperture using the force, and a bit of experience, but mainly the force. With practice, you will get to know what kinds of numbers to use when. Landscapes generally want everything in focus, so you'll be looking towards the higher f-stops, whereas we tend to like a shallow depth of field for portraits, so lower f-stops here are useful. Low light will need longer shutter speeds and fast-moving objects faster ones. Life's a compromise, you get the idea. Sometimes it's fun to just listen to the clicks instead of taking any photos. You can use the built-in light meter, which is very basic. It's just a needle that tells you how bright the image is, and a circle which moves as you change the aperture. Line them up, and you have a properly exposed image. It's quite fun. That being said, this light meter, and many in lots of older cameras, was built to use 1.35 volt mercury batteries. You can't buy those anymore, but hearing aid batteries do work quite well. Or you could just do what I do, which is use a 1.5 volt watch battery and accept that you never really know if it's properly exposed or not. So now the exposure is probably correct, it's time to concentrate and focus. Look through the viewfinder and you'll see the focusing screen. They will all look slightly different, and some models, like the Canon F1, allow you to change them. Turn the focus ring until the centre of the image is in focus, or until the lines line up, or until Venus is in retrograde, or until whatever is supposed to happen happens. They all work in different ways, but they all do the same job. Once you're focused, it's interesting to note that if you look at the top of the lens, it will tell you how far away your subject is. These lines also give you a quantitative indication of your depth of field without using the depth of field preview. It is just worth saying that the depth of field isn't actually real. The only distance that will be in true focus is the exact distance that you focus on. The depth of field is just the extent of acceptable focusedness. Once your film is full, which you'll know because you won't be able to advance the lever anymore, and your frame window will tell you that you're end of your film, it's time to wind the film back. Flip the camera over and press this lovely little button. Its position might vary, but most of them are down here. As an aside, you can also press this if you want to take a double exposure. Just take your first photo, then press it, and the next photo you take will be exposed onto the same piece of film. This often happens accidentally. Anyway, now you can flip the handle out and start to wind the film back, following the arrow. Keep going until it becomes easy. This means that the film is completely wound back to the canister and it's safe to open the back. Pop up the winder as before and take the film out. Then forget about the film and find it 3 weeks down the line. The longer you wait, the better your pictures will be.